The frontier demanded a certain looseness of faith, a willingness to bend doctrine when survival itself became the only true religion. On the edge of the known world, beliefs blurred, and desperation softened skepticism. It was within this moral fog that a secret took root in the hills of eastern Oregon, buried beneath silence so deliberate it hardened into law. For more than a century, officials pretended nothing had happened there, even as whispers refused to die. Between the early years of westward expansion and the fading twilight of the trail era, entire wagon parties vanished along a narrow stretch of land. Not claimed by sickness, not lost to storms or broken axles. They were taken by something that understood human hope intimately and used it as bait. At the center of this darkness stood a humble chapel, its weathered boards offering the promise of mercy to the dying. The Sacred Heart Chapel looked like a blessing carved from timber, a sanctuary for travelers who had already sacrificed everything for a future they might never reach. Yet beneath its cross and hymns pulsed a system of killing so careful, so rehearsed, that it transformed murder into ritual. What began as scattered disappearances evolved into a legacy of calculated annihilation, orchestrated by a single family who learned to measure human life in supplies, livestock, and gold. The Graysons did not kill in fits of rage or panic. They refined it. They documented it. They turned suffering into an enterprise and faith into a mask. Before stepping fully into that abyss, a warning must be spoken. Gospel of the Haunted is not a refuge for the faint-hearted. It exists to exhume what was intentionally forgotten, to stare unblinking at truths that rot beneath national myths. Only those willing to endure the weight of these revelations should continue listening. Those who do become witnesses, bound to the echoes of the past. With that understanding, the journey begins, back to a year when the trail still glittered with promise and horror walked openly among the hopeful. The Oregon Trail stretched endlessly westward, a scar across the continent, carrying dreams through unforgiving wilderness. Families abandoned familiar soil, selling their pasts for a chance at rebirth. Every mile demanded payment in sweat, blood, and grief. Long before reaching Oregon's interior, exhaustion hollowed faces and thinned resolve. By the time wagon trains climbed toward the Blue Mountains, bodies were failing and supplies were fading. Illness spread quietly, turning children pale and strong men weak. It was here, in this landscape of fragility, that death learned to smile. A year before the largest waves of migration crested, a man calling himself Father Grayson erected the Sacred Heart Chapel on a rise overlooking a natural resting place along the trail. The spot was already heavy with sorrow, a place where oxen were unyoked and fresh graves marked those who could go no farther. The chapel appeared as an answer to prayer, a sign that God had not abandoned the weary. Marai presented himself as a missionary, his voice calm yet commanding, his eyes pale and unsettlingly focused. Scripture flowed from him with practiced ease, enough to quiet suspicion and inspire trust. At his side stood his wife, known to travelers as Sister Constance. Her hands were gentle, her smile reassuring, her knowledge of herbs and remedies convincing enough to ease panic. She tended to fevered children and whispered comfort to the dying, her presence radiating compassion. Completing the image was Marai's younger brother, Ezekiel, a man of practical skill and quiet strength. He repaired broken wagons, treated injured animals, and spoke little, allowing his usefulness to earn gratitude without question. Together, they formed a trinity of salvation, drawing the desperate closer with every act of kindness. The chapel itself was plain yet meticulously cared for. Rough benches faced a simple altar, and a wooden cross loomed overhead, its surface scarred as if it had absorbed years of silent prayers. Beside the building lay a small cemetery, its markers hastily carved, many left blank. What travelers noticed less was the unusually deep basement beneath the chapel floor. The Graysons explained it away as storage, a place to keep provisions for those in need. In a land where scarcity ruled, the explanation felt generous rather than suspicious. Isolation wrapped the chapel like a shroud. Few homesteads dotted the surrounding hills, and the nearest trading post lay far enough away to discourage frequent visits. This distance protected the Graysons, shielding their routines from scrutiny. Locals spoke of them with respect, praising their devotion and sacrifice. After all, who would choose to live among death unless guided by pure faith? What made the Graysons truly monstrous was their understanding of human weakness. They knew exhaustion dulled judgment. They knew grief made people pliable. They positioned themselves as more than clergy, offering rest, medicine, and shelter. Families too weak to continue were invited to stay, reassured that pausing was wise, even holy. Denominations dissolved in the face of fear. Marai adjusted his sermons to suit any belief, quoting scripture in whatever cadence soothed his listeners most. Faith became a language he spoke fluently, not to save souls, but to harvest them. And so, beneath hymns and whispered prayers, beneath the illusion of sanctuary, a machine of death began to turn. Each act fed the next. Each disappearance vanished into the wilderness without record or question. The hills absorbed the screams. The trail moved on, and the Sacred Heart Chapel stood patiently, waiting for the next wagon to crest the rise, carrying hope straight into the waiting dark. Only trust in ASMRCY. Those words were spoken softly, almost tenderly, as if compassion itself had found a human voice. Your husband will soon join your precious babies in paradise. Some illnesses, Father Marai whispered, were not curses but Kelings, divine invitations sent by God to gather his children home. Who were mortals to question such wisdom? In the dim lamplight of the Sacred Heart Chapel, grief was reframed as blessing, and doubt was quietly strangled before it could breathe. The first shadow fell late in the season, when the trail was already heavy with sorrow. The Morrison family had been traveling west with a larger wagon train, but like so many others, they separated after reaching Oregon territory, believing the worst was behind them. James Morrison trusted his hands, his oxen, and his faith. His wife Elizabeth, heavy with child, believed the land ahead would cradle their future. Their children laughed in the dust, unaware that the trail had already marked them. Even Elizabeth's aging father Samuel, stiff with years and pain, carried hope in his weary bones. When the wagon axle snapped only a short distance from the chapel, it felt like PRVDMCE. From the ridge, James saw the small wooden structure standing alone against the hills, its cross dark against the sky. Later records would say he described it as a miracle, a sign that God still watched over them. Before despair could fully take hold, Brother Ezekiel appeared, as if summoned by need itself. His timing always seemed uncanny, his presence reassuring in a way that disarmed caution. "The Lord has placed you here for a reason," Ezekiel said calmly, his voice steady and practiced. He spoke of sanctuary, of rest, of Sister Constance's skill with childbirth and healing. Elizabeth's condition, he noted gently, meant she should not continue the journey just yet. Father Morai, he promised, would be honored to shelter them. The invitation felt warm, unavoidable. Gratitude drowned out hesitation, and the Morrisons accepted without question. They moved into the small cabin beside the chapel, a place prepared for exactly this kind of need. The first days passed in a fragile peace. Sister Constance tended Elizabeth with careful hands and soothing words. Ezekiel worked beside James, repairing the wagon and speaking little. Father Morai prayed with them each evening, his sermons perfectly tailored to comfort anxious hearts. The children played beneath the open sky, and Samuel rested in a rocking chair, grateful for stillness after endless miles. Then the rhythm shifted. Samuel was the first to falter. It began with pain deep in his stomach, sharp and unrelenting, followed by waves of nausea that left him pale and trembling. Sister Constance assured them it was nothing unusual, merely trail sickness, the body's response to exhaustion and change. She prepared a remedy in the chapel basement, speaking softly about nature's gifts and the need for the body to cleanse itself before healing could begin. Her smile never wavered. Within hours, Samuel worsened. His skin dulled to an unnatural gray. His breath rattled, shallow and strained. His body betrayed him in violent spasms that filled the cabin with the sounds of suffering. James panicked, suggesting they seek help from the trading post far to the east. Father Morai intervened, his hand heavy on James's shoulder, his voice calm and absolute. Moving him now would be a death sentence, he said. The sickness must complete its course. Faith demanded patience. By the time the sun rose again, unease had settled into the walls. Days passed, and the illness spread. Young Tommy began to complain of pain, then little Mary followed, their small bodies racked with the same merciless symptoms. Sister Constance worked endlessly, administering more of her purifying treatments, keeping watch through the night like a devoted guardian. To James and Elizabeth, exhausted and terrified, she appeared as an angel sent to guide them through a trial no family should endure. But beneath the prayers and whispered hymns, something far darker was at work. The remedies were poison, measured with precision. Arsenic, acquired quietly and legally under the guise of pest control, dissolved into mixtures that mimicked the very diseases pioneers feared most. The cramps, the vomiting, the discoloration, the slow collapse of organs, all blended seamlessly into the familiar language of trail death. Nothing looked out of place. Nothing raised suspicion. Grief had already taught these families what dying looked like. Samuel was laid to rest first, his passing marked by solemn prayers and promises of peace beyond this world. Days later, Tommy followed, then Mary. Each burial was accompanied by Father Morai's voice rising and falling with practiced sorrow. speaking of heavenly reunions and release from suffering. Elizabeth wept until her body shook, clutching her swollen belly, whispering prayers for the child yet to be born. James held her, hollowed by loss, never imagining that the hands offering comfort were also counting what remained. Each night, after tears dried and prayers faded into exhausted sleep, Ezekiel moved silently through the cabin. He catalogued possessions with meticulous care, lifting blankets, opening chests, weighing value with a predator's patience. The Morrison wagon carried more than memories. Tools, heirlooms, furniture, and gold carefully hidden within James's clothing were noted, sorted, and claimed. The dead no longer needed them. When James himself fell ill, the final act began. The familiar pain returned, cruel and unmistakable. Elizabeth, now trembling with the first signs of labor, begged Sister Constance to save him. Her voice cracked with terror, her hands clutched desperately for hope. Sister Constance held them, her touch steady, her expression serene. "My dear child," she said softly, her eyes reflecting the lamplight like cold glass, "sometimes God asks us to surrender everything. Trust in HISMRCY." And in that moment, as another life slipped quietly toward darkness, the chapel remained still, faithful, and patient, waiting for the next prayer to be answered with silence. The promise was whispered gently, almost lovingly, that she would live on and raise her newborn son, comforted by the certainty that the rest of her family waited in glory. Those words clung to Elizabeth Morrison like a fragile lifeline, even as the air around her thickened with decay. James Morrison slipped away, not in a sudden storm of agony, but quietly, his strength drained drop by drop until there was nothing left to give. His death came just hours before Elizabeth's labor began, the cruel timing sealed as if by design. The child arrived amid grief and trembling prayers, drawing a single breath before Father Moray's hands touched his forehead, baptizing him into a world he would never know. The infant's cry faded almost as soon as it began, swallowed by the stillness of the chapel walls. Elizabeth did not last long after that. The same sickness claimed her body days later, its symptoms now unmistakable, yet still cloaked in the language of divine will. In less than a month, the Morrison family ceased to exist, erased so completely that even their echoes seemed to dissolve into the Oregon soil. To anyone who might have asked, the explanation was neat, respectable, and utterly convincing. The family had arrived already weakened, victims of a violent sickness that sometimes swept through entire households. The Graysons had done all they could, risking their own safety to offer care, prayer, and dignity in death. The bodies rested in consecrated ground. Their belongings had been devoted to sacred purposes. Everything sounded proper. Everything sounded righteous. But beneath that story pulsed a revelation that would reshape the Graysons' lives and curse the trail for decades. They had learned something, TREFING in its simplicity. When wrapped in scripture and patience, murder could become not only invisible, but profitable. Their first success revealed a pattern hidden in plain sight. Families traveling alone were easier to isolate. Slow poisons could masquerade perfectly as familiar illnesses, and religious authority, spoken with confidence, silenced questions before they could form. Grief needed guidance, and the Graysons were always ready to provide it. The trail itself offered endless opportunity. It was a river of strangers, flowing west without witnesses or accountability. Families disappeared regularly, claimed by disease, accidents, or the wilderness itself. Months could pass before anyone noticed the silence, and by then, explanations came easily. Distance protected the killers better than walls ever could. Each vanished wagon dissolved into rumor, and rumor dissolved into myth. In the wake of the Morrison deaths, the Graysons refined their craft. What had begun as an experiment hardened into routine. Brother Ezekiel took on a new role, moving along the approaches to the chapel with casual purpose. He observed wagons carefully, noting which families carried themselves with quiet wealth, which traveled without the safety of numbers, which already bore the marks of exhaustion or illness. He remembered faces, accents, hesitations. He learned how desperation sounded before it was spoken. Sister Constance turned her attention inward, perfecting her mixtures with almost scholarly devotion. She adjusted quantities, altered delivery, learned how different bodies responded. Arsenic slipped easily into teas meant to soothe, into tinctures blessed with prayer, into wine shared in moments of solemn communion. Death came gently when she wished it to, violently when needed, always wearing the mask of inevitability. The line between healing and harm vanished beneath her steady hands. Father Morai focused on the mind. He studied people as closely as Scripture, listening for the rhythms of their belief. With some, he spoke of miracles and divine intervention. With others, he leaned into destiny, reminding them that all things unfolded according to a higher design. He offered certainty in moments of chaos, absolution in moments of doubt. As loved ones weakened and died, his words guided grief away from suspicion and toward acceptance. God had chosen. God had taken. Who could argue with that? The chapel itself changed, though only subtly. Its basement grew deeper, divided with careful intention, one space filled with possessions stripped of identity, stacked and sorted like inventory. Another became a place of preparation, where powders dissolved and liquids darkened under watchful eyes. A third area held bodies briefly, hidden from sight while decisions were made. Outside, among a stand of trees, the earth was disturbed again and again. Graves without markers waited patiently, absorbing secrets that would never be confessed. Winter brought silence to the trail, and with it time. The Graysons spent those months examining their spoils, deciding what could be used, what could be sold, and what must never be seen. They made contact with men who valued profit over questions, men who understood that frontier life bred strange circumstances. Ezekiel proved especially skilled here. His calm demeanor and honest gaze disarmed suspicion. He spoke of families turning back, of deaths from natural causes, of helping neighbors settle affairs. Goods were dispersed carefully, never all in one place. Furniture went to settlers eager for comfort. Tools passed into the hands of farmers. Jewelry and gold slipped quietly into mercantile channels, leaving no trail behind. By the time spring returned, the Graysons were no longer improvising. They had become predators with structure, discipline, and confidence. Every step, from selection to disposal, had been rehearsed. Even more powerful was the image they projected to the world. Devout, selfless, unquestionable. The idea that such people could harbor monstrous intent felt impossible to those who met them. When the trail filled again with fresh faces and fragile hope, the chapel stood ready. The hills watched, the graves waited, and soon another family would crest the rise, drawn toward the cross and the promise of mercy, unaware that the gospel of the haunted was about to claim them next. Father Morai learned quickly when to advance and when to retreat. When a wary traveler mentioned, almost in passing, that Sister Constance had spoken of sickness lingering in the region, and then added firmly that they possessed the skills and tools to manage their own repairs, Morai did not argue. He did not insist. He smiled, offered a blessing, and stepped back as if respect itself guided his movements. That restraint was deliberate. He had become adept at reading hesitation, at sensing when pressure would fracture trust rather than bend it. Sometimes the most effective trap was patience. The Hoffmans arrived carrying more than hope. Their wagon was heavy with the weight of a lifetime, carefully condensed into wood and iron. Fine tools crafted for delicate work, rich textiles wrapped against the dust, and gold coins hidden with the caution of people who had learned not to trust the world too easily. They were immigrants, strangers in language and custom, their words shaped by unfamiliar rhythms. That barrier made them vulnerable in ways they could not yet imagine. They depended on the Graysons to interpret, to explain, to guide. Their accents marked them as outsiders, and outsiders drew less attention when they vanished. Heinrich Hoffmann was a clockmaker, a man who understood precision and patience. His hands were meant to measure time, not to defend against it. His wife Greta carried new life within her, her pregnancy slowing her steps and softening her resolve. Their children, old enough to sense fear, but too young to name it, stayed close to the wagon when mechanical trouble forced them to seek help near the Sacred Heart Chapel. The Graysons recognized an opportunity to refine what they had already begun. This family would be a lesson. Sister Constance changed her approach. There would be no waiting for chance illness. Instead, she offered protection. Preventive care, she called it. Small doses slipped into teas and tonics, framed as safeguards against the diseases that haunted the trail. She spoke gently, invoking God's mercy and nature's balance, assuring the Hoffmans that early treatment was the greatest blessing of all. Heinrich's gratitude was immediate and sincere. In broken English, he thanked her for her kindness, for caring for strangers without expectation. She answered with practiced humility, claiming the blessing was hers, that serving God's children was reward enough. The poison worked slowly, invisibly. It softened their strength without raising alarm. Days stretched into weeks, and the family remained alive long enough for the Graysons to learn everything. They observed habits, routines, relationships. They noted which child clung to which parent, who rose first, who slept lightly. Every detail became useful. Meanwhile, the extended timeline allowed their possessions to be catalogued with care. Clockmaking tools were examined and assessed. Trade goods were sorted. Plans formed for where each item would eventually disappear into the frontier economy. By the time the Hoffmans were finally erased, nearly a month had passed. It was not haste the Graysons sought, but mastery. Each death reinforced a truth they were beginning to accept fully. This was no longer survival. It was a SYSTM. By the end of that year, multiple families had vanished under their care, entire bloodlines reduced to entries and profits. What once required improvisation now followed procedure. They began to see themselves not as sinners, but as operators of a grim enterprise that demanded organization. Records were kept, not prayers, not confessions. Ledgers, hidden deep within the chapel, behind false walls and beneath loose floorboards, books were filled with Father Morai's precise handwriting. Names were listed alongside dates. Possessions were itemized. Methods were analyzed. Bodies were reduced to locations. Each entry was clinical, stripped of emotion, written as if human lives were no different from cargo. Mistakes were noted. Improvements suggested. Adjustments made. These books, discovered long after the chapel fell silent, would become the most damning testimony of all. They did not scream. They did not plead. They simply stated facts, and in doing so revealed an evil more chilling than chaos. As word spread of the Graysons' charity, the trap tightened. Families began seeking them out intentionally. Stories traveled faster than warnings. Tales of kind Christians offering shelter and aid circulated along the trail, and desperation guided wagons directly to the chapel's door. The Graysons no longer needed to hunt. Victims arrived willingly, believing salvation waited at the end of exhaustion. Over time, the operation grew more complex. Father Morai approached it with the mind of a strategist. Killing was only one component. Selection, manipulation, disposal, and profit all required careful balance. He spoke of their work as a calling, but his actions mirrored those of a merchant refining supply chains. Every success reinforced his confidence. Every failure sharpened his resolve. Then came the Weatherby family, and with them, a new challenge. They arrived not as innocents, but as observers. Charles Weatherby had once commanded men. He understood discipline and threat. His wife Margaret was educated, cautious, her eyes always searching for inconsistencies. Their twin daughters watched quietly, absorbing everything. David, Margaret's brother, carried the tools of a skilled blacksmith, each piece valuable, each one heavy with purpose. Wealth traveled with them, converted into gold and jewelry, hidden with ingenuity. When trouble struck their wagon near the chapel, Charles did not rush to accept help. He had heard the stories, travelers who vanished after accepting kindness. The isolation unsettled him. The timing of Ezekiel's arrival felt too perfect. Morai sensed the resistance immediately. This would not be a matter of simple persuasion. Charles thanked him politely, expressing appreciation for Christian charity, while making it clear they intended to move on as soon as repairs were complete. His voice carried the edge of someone accustomed to command. Morai listened. He nodded. He did not push. He offered a blessing and withdrew, already adjusting his strategy. Some prey required time, some required misdirection, and some, Morai knew, required breaking not of the body first, but of certainty itself. As the sun dipped behind the hills, the chapel stood silent once more. Inside, plans shifted. Outside, the trail creaked and whispered, carrying another family deeper into the waiting dark. And the gospel of the haunted continued, written not in scripture, but in blood and patience, echoing through the wilderness with every unmarked grave. Father Marai spoke softly, his concern carefully measured, suggesting that what lingered in the air might be more than simple fatigue. Perhaps cholera, perhaps dysentery, illnesses that crept unseen before revealing their teeth. He said it almost casually, as if the thought had just occurred to him, adding that staying a short while might be wise until it was certain no one carried the sickness further along the trail. Of course, he told Charles with gentle respect, a man's first duty was to protect his family. Still, Marai would fail his Christian calling if he did not mention that Sister Constance had already been treating several travelers struck by trail fever. Such afflictions, he warned, often hid quietly before erupting, and travel during that time could weaken the body and spread suffering to loved ones. The words landed exactly where he intended. Margaret Wetherb, worn thin by endless days of dust and fear, felt the weight of them settle in her chest. Her daughters had been coughing in their sleep. David looked pale. Doubt crept in, slow and poisonous. When David awoke the next morning flushed with a mild fever, Sister Constance was ready with calm certainty. This, she said, was how it began. A warning sign. The family's resolve cracked. Perhaps, Margaret whispered to Charles, they should accept the offer of shelter, just until David recovered. Charles agreed, though every instinct told him to remain watchful. Unlike those before them, Charles did not surrender vigilance. His eyes followed every movement. His questions were sharp, probing the Graysons' past, their work, the fate of others who had stayed beneath this roof. He listened more than he spoke. The Graysons adjusted seamlessly. They told stories polished smooth with repetition, tales of families healed and sent safely on their way. They walked him through the small cemetery, pointing out graves they claimed belonged to travelers who arrived already beyond saving. They produced letters, careful forgeries filled with gratitude and praise, written by families who supposedly survived. Each piece was designed to quiet suspicion, to replace fear with reason. One evening, as dusk bled into night, Father Marai joined Charles on the chapel porch. He spoke as an equal, acknowledging his service, his caution, his strength. A man trained in war, he said, learned to trust slowly, and rightly so. But he asked a question that lingered like smoke. If harm were intended, would it not have come already? Would they not choose weaker prey than an armed soldier with disciplined eyes? The logic was subtle, flattering, and effective. Charles felt seen, respected. Slowly, almost unwillingly, his guard lowered. What followed unfolded over weeks, not days. Sister Constance altered her methods, delivering poison in such minute quantities that sickness bloomed like something natural. Water she claimed had been blessed. Remedies meant to protect. The symptoms crept in so gradually they seemed inevitable rather than inflicted. David fell first, his small body unable to endure what was fed to him with such care. His death appeared to confirm every warning Sister Constance had offered. The family clung to her, grateful for her presence, for the way she guided them through grief with steady hands and soothing words. Margaret weakened next. Her illness was framed as exhaustion, the cost of nursing her brother through his final days. Charles watched closely now. Patterns emerged that unsettled him. He and his daughters remained untouched while others declined. The symptoms followed a familiar arc. The Graysons were always present at the worst moments, always guiding, always intervening. His unease sharpened into something colder. Late one night, he caught Ezekiel near the wagon, examining their belongings by lantern light. When challenged, Ezekiel explained calmly that he was ensuring their supplies were safe from animals. The story fit neatly enough, but Charles's instincts recoiled. He said nothing then, but the seed of certainty took root. The next morning, as Margaret lay fading, Charles whispered to her that they needed to leave. Something was deeply wrong, but she was too weak. Moving her would mean killing her with his own hands. He was trapped between suspicion and love, between action and loss. The truth revealed itself in the chapel basement. Searching for medicine, Charles discovered what was never meant to be found: hidden compartments stuffed with possessions that told silent stories. A child's doll worn and loved. A pocket watch engraved with an unfamiliar name. Letters never sent, written by hopeful hands, thanking God for kindness and care at this very place. One letter, dated not long ago, spoke of sick children resting safely under Christian guardianship. The words burned into Charles's mind. This was not charity. This was a slaughterhouse dressed as sanctuary. Understanding crashed over him with terrible clarity. Other families had come here believing in mercy. None had left. His own family was being erased piece by piece. But realization arrived too late. Margaret died that night, her breath slipping away as Charles held her hand, rage and grief twisting together until he could barely breathe. Morning came, gray and silent. Charles awoke with pain coiling in his stomach, with nausea rising like a familiar echo. He knew then that the path before him had already been walked by others. The chapel stood quiet, its walls absorbing another truth never spoken aloud. Outside, the trail waited, indifferent. Inside, the gospel of the haunted continued its sermon, preached not with words, but with patience, deception, and the slow certainty of death. What Charles never understood, even as the strength drained from his limbs and the room seemed to tilt and darken, was that his doubt had already sealed his fate. The Graysons had been studying him long before he suspected them, tracking every pause in his speech, every lingering glance toward locked doors, every question asked one beat too late. They sensed the shift in him like hunters scenting fear, and so they acted, not with haste, but with precision. The evening meal was prepared with care, seasoned with warmth and false kindness, and laced with a dose meant not to kill swiftly, but to unravel him completely. The poison worked its way through his body like a slow, burning whisper. Muscles that once carried him through battle failed him. Breath became effort. Thought became fog. By the time Charles realized what was happening, he was already beyond rescue. His twin daughters sat beside the bed, their small hands clutched in his, eyes shining with trust and confusion as he tried to speak. He forced the words through lips gone numb, trying to name the danger, to tear away the mask that hid the smiling faces who hovered nearby. But his voice cracked, his thoughts tangled, and what emerged sounded like madness. Fevered rambling. The Graysons watched in solemn silence as the girls nodded politely, dismissing their father's warnings as the delirium of a dying man. They comforted him gently, assuring the children that all was well, and the girls believed them. That moment became a lesson carved deep into the Graysons' understanding of human weakness. They learned that sharp minds required subtler blades, that suspicion was not an obstacle, but a variable to be managed. They discovered that death stretched over time felt more natural, more convincing, and far more profitable. A long decline drew no immediate questions, invited sympathy instead of alarm, and allowed them to study their victims as carefully as livestock. They refined their ability to identify those who doubted, those who noticed too much, and they perfected methods to soothe, redirect, and silence concern before it could harden into action. The Weatherby affair proved something essential and intoxicating to them. Even disciplined, intelligent individuals could be guided gently into the grave, provided the mind was handled with patience and the hand administering death never trembled. Confidence followed. With it came ambition. Wealthier families, respected names, travelers whose absence would echo across states and territories, all became viable targets. The Graysons no longer feared scrutiny. They believed they could outthink it. Evidence uncovered beneath the chapel floor forced further evolution. Objects once carelessly hidden were now destroyed with ritual focus. Letters burned to ash. Jewelry melted into anonymous metal. Possessions worth keeping were secreted away in places designed to outlast memory itself. By the end of that grim chapter, entire bloodlines had vanished into silence, their wealth quietly absorbed, their names reduced to rumors that never quite formed. The Graysons no longer saw themselves as murderers. In their minds, they were chosen, rewarded, instruments of something immortal and merciless, permitted to prosper because they understood what others could not. Then came the year when certainty cracked. It began as so many others had, with the creak of wagon wheels and the dust of the trail. The Patterson family arrived from the east carrying hope, gold, and the belief that opportunity waited patiently at the journey's end. Thomas Patterson was a man who trusted preparation more than chance. He had converted his success into weightless wealth, easy to carry, easier to steal. He traveled with his wife Emily, their children ranging from innocence to near adulthood, and Emily's sister Katherine, a quiet, observant woman who taught the children and watched the world with careful eyes. They were respectable, connected, the kind of disappearance that would not simply dissolve into wilderness myth. When their larger company split near the mountains, the Pattersons continued alone, unaware that isolation was the Graysons' most cherished ally. Ezekiel encountered them on the road, not by accident, but by design. Their wagon showed no sign of distress, no obvious vulnerability. That had never stopped him before. Opportunity, he believed, was something you shaped, not something you waited for. He approached with warmth, his voice carrying easily across the space between them, praising their oxen, admiring their progress, planting familiarity where none should exist. Thomas listened, weighing each word as he would a business proposition. The offer of supplies sounded reasonable, but the eagerness beneath it set his instincts humming. He declined politely, intent on moving on. Ezekiel smiled, unoffended, already prepared for resistance. Then he introduced fear. He spoke of illness not as a threat, but as a secret. Mountain fever. A sickness that crept quietly, stealing strength before it announced itself. He spoke of Sister Constance and her remedies, of prevention rather than cure. The words drifted toward Emily like smoke, slipping past reason and settling into maternal terror. Her gaze went immediately to her children, scanning faces for signs that were not there. She had not heard of disease in the area, but Ezekiel explained that such things were rarely advertised. Bad for morale, bad for trade. His concern felt genuine, practiced. Par FVT, Thomas hesitated. His mind remained cautious. But caution weakens when faced with the imagined suffering of one's children. Emily's voice was soft when she spoke to him, but urgency vibrated beneath it. What harm could there be in a brief stop, a simple examination, a precaution against an invisible enemy? Against his better judgment, he agreed. The wagon turned. As the chapel came into view, standing calm and unassuming against the land, none of them felt the shift. None sensed that they were crossing an invisible line, stepping into a place where intentions dissolved and outcomes were decided long before arrival. Somewhere inside, the gospel of the haunted was already unfolding, not in sermons or scripture, but in silence, in patience, and in the quiet certainty that one of them would see too much. And that survival, when it came, would change everything. Thomas told himself the stop was temporary, nothing more than a pause to gather information about a rumor of sickness before resuming their journey. A practical delay, a reasonable choice. He clung to that thought as if it could anchor him against the unease curling in his chest. He could not know that this single decision would fracture his life, that it would drag his family into a place where kindness was a costume and faith was sharpened into a weapon. By the time doubt truly reached him, escape would no longer be a simple matter of turning the wagon around. The Graysons welcomed the Patterson family, as they welcomed all others, with practiced warmth that felt reassuring and sincere. Hands were clasped. Smiles lingered just long enough. Father Marai spoke with Thomas as one businessman to another, discussing trade routes, opportunities in Oregon, and the promise of profit for men who planned wisely. His knowledge felt authentic, his interest flattering. Sister Constance drew Emily in with gentle words and an almost radiant affection for children, touching their hair, asking their names, listening as though each answer mattered deeply. Brother Ezekiel became a source of endless amusement, spinning tales of frontier survival and demonstrating skills that made the children laugh and stare in awe. The family relaxed, tension easing, vigilance slipping away piece by piece. By nightfall, the decision was made to remain at the chapel. Sister Constance insisted that examinations should not be rushed, that mountain fever was subtle and merciless if ignored. Her tone carried concern, not urgency, and that made it more convincing. When the examinations concluded, the verdict was delivered softly. Several members, she said, showed early signs. Nothing alarming, only the faint beginnings of something that required immediate prevention. Medicine was prepared. Katherine Patterson was first to accept it. Katherine had lived her life in quiet service to others, caring for her sister's children as though they were her own. The idea that she might protect them from unseen danger gave her purpose. She drank the medicine without hesitation and encouraged the rest to do the same, smiling reassuringly even as the bitter taste lingered. Yet beneath her calm exterior, her mind was always working. She noticed things others did not. Patterns. Inconsistencies. The second night, she saw Ezekiel lingering near their wagon, lifting canvas, peering inside, his hands moving with deliberate attention. When she mentioned it, Sister Constance dismissed the concern with ease, explaining that all guests' belongings were checked for safety, a precaution born of past troubles. The explanation sounded reasonable, but it did not erase the image from Katherine's thoughts. As days passed, unease grew. Father Morai's gaze lingered too long on Thomas's watch, his eyes calculating, measuring. Sister Constance never allowed anyone to witness the preparation of her remedies, retreating alone with herbs and bottles, emerging only when the medicine was ready. And always, without fail, those who drank it seemed to worsen. Weakness deepened. New symptoms appeared. The cure demanded more of itself. Katherine felt dread settle into her bones. On the fourth day, fear sharpened into certainty. She saw Sister Constance adding a fine white powder to a dose meant for young Timothy, the youngest and most fragile of the children. When Katherine questioned it, the response came quickly, too quickly. Blessed salt, she was told, meant to strengthen the medicine's effect. But Katherine knew better. She had grown up watching her father work among powders and compounds. This substance did not look like salt. More disturbing still was the flicker of unease that crossed Sister Constance's face, the sudden defensiveness where calm devotion usually lived. The mask slipped for a heartbeat. It was enough. That night, Katherine chose life. When her medicine was brought, she raised the cup to her lips and pretended to swallow, letting the liquid spill quietly into a handkerchief hidden in her sleeve. Later, she whispered to Timothy, turning defiance into a game, teaching him how to fool the watchful eyes around them. He trusted her completely. He did as she said. What followed was undeniable. As the others faded, Katherine and Timothy remained strong. The difference was stark, terrifying in its clarity. Those who obeyed most faithfully were dying fastest. By the sixth day, death had entered the family openly. 2 of the children were gone, their bodies still and cold, prayers whispered too late. Thomas lay near the edge, breath shallow, eyes glassy, his strength spent. Emily was weak but awake, clinging to hope because the alternative was unbearable. Katherine sat beside her and finally spoke the words she had been holding back, her voice barely a breath. These people are poisoning us. They are killing our family. Shock turned to anger, then to horror as Katherine laid out what she had seen, the patterns she could no longer deny. Emily listened, and something broke inside her. The truth settled like ice. What could they do? They were trapped, barely able to stand, surrounded by those who meant them harm. Katherine already knew the answer, though it tore at her heart. They had to leave. Staying meant certain death. Timothy had to come with them. He was the only other one untouched. Before dawn, they moved. Katherine helped Emily from the cabin, Timothy silent at her side. Thomas could not be moved. The older children did not stir. Leaving them behind was agony beyond words, but hesitation would doom them all. At the wagon, Katherine retrieved the supplies she had hidden, hands shaking as footsteps echoed nearby. A sound had carried, a board creaked. Father Morai was approaching, his presence a shadow moving toward them. Katherine's whisper cut through the darkness. "Hide. Now." They climbed beneath the canvas, hearts pounding, breath held as the footsteps drew closer. In that suffocating stillness, with death searching just beyond reach, the gospel of the haunted held its breath, waiting to see who would survive the night. Father Morai stepped into the dim space beside the wagon, and in the thin lantern light his face told Katherine everything she needed to know. There was no concern there, no gentle curiosity about a woman wandering in the night. What stared back at her was calculation, sharp and cold, like a blade measuring distance. In that instant, the last fragile hope that she might still be mistaken died inside her. He spoke softly, as though they were alone in a place of safety. He addressed her by name, reminding her that illness could cloud the mind, that fever invited confusion and reckless choices. His voice carried the tone of authority, of a man accustomed to being obeyed. Katherine forced herself to answer calmly, explaining that sleep would not come, that worry for her family kept her awake. As she spoke, she felt his gaze moving over her, not seeing her as a person, but as a problem to be solved. The silence stretched, heavy and suffocating, until she felt certain he was deciding whether she already knew too much. When he suggested a stronger remedy, something to ensure deeper rest, the threat beneath his words was unmistakable. He was no longer hiding. He was offering her death, politely, efficiently, under the guise of care. Katherine felt fear surge through her, but she held it down, replying with gratitude, insisting she would try to rest on her own. His response was immediate and firm. He insisted. His hand drifted beneath his coat, and in that movement Katherine saw the end approaching. What saved her was not strength, but desperation. As Morai advanced, a shadow moved behind him. Emily stepped into view, swaying on her feet, her face pale and hollow, but her hands steady around the pistol she had taken from her dying husband. Her voice shook, yet it carried a force that stopped Morai in his tracks. She told him to step away. For a fraction of a second, his attention shifted, and that was enough. Katherine acted without thought. Her hand closed around a heavy iron tool lying near the wagon, and she swung with everything she had left. The impact rang through the night, a dull, terrible sound. Morai fell, not dead, but stunned, his authority shattered in an instant. Katherine did not wait to see him move again. She pulled Emily forward. Timothy clutched between them, and they fled. The wagon lurched into motion as shouts echoed behind them. From the corner of her vision, Katherine saw Brother Ezekiel burst from the chapel, drawn by the noise. His attention turned not toward them, but toward the cabin where the rest of the family lay helpless. Katherine knew, with sickening certainty, what he was going to do. She forced herself not to look back again. The Sacred Heart Chapel receded into darkness as they escaped, carrying with them the weight of lives left behind. The days that followed blurred into a single, endless nightmare. Emily faded in and out of awareness, her body ravaged by poison, her voice breaking the silence with cries for children who would never answer. Katherine drove the wagon with trembling hands, her eyes constantly searching the horizon, expecting pursuit at every sound. Timothy barely spoke, his small body rigid with shock, his gaze fixed on nothing at all. Grief rode with them, heavy and unrelenting. They did not know where they were going. They followed faint trails, animal paths, anything that might lead them toward people, instead of back into the wilderness. Each night Katherine feared Emily would not wake again. Each morning she feared they would see the chapel rising ahead of them, like a curse they could not outrun. Time lost meaning. Only survival mattered. When they finally encountered soldiers, the relief was almost unbearable. Katherine told their story with a voice that felt like it belonged to someone else, watching disbelief spread across the faces before her. It sounded impossible even to her own ears, but she had not fled empty-handed. She produced the vial of medicine she had saved, the powder she had hidden away, the small pieces of evidence she had clung to like proof of sanity. Emily's condition spoke louder than words. Her body told the truth no one wanted to hear. The soldiers went to the chapel. What they found there confirmed everything. The remaining members of the Patterson family were dead, their bodies marked by the same slow poison. The Graysons were gone, leaving behind only silence and the echo of their work. In the hidden spaces beneath the chapel, investigators uncovered the true horror. Belongings from countless families lay sorted and stored, stripped of names but not of meaning. And there were records. Pages filled with careful handwriting, detailing lives ended, profits gained, lessons learned, murder reduced to routine. The scope of it shattered any illusion that this was an isolated evil. It was systematic. It was deliberate. It was sanctified in the minds of those who committed it. Katherine's survival cracked the mask, but it did not bring peace. The knowledge of what had been done, and how long it had been allowed to continue, spread like poison through the trail communities. Trust died. Kindness became suspect. Faith itself felt tainted. The cost followed the survivors forever. Emily never truly recovered. Her body, weakened beyond repair, failed her within a year. Timothy grew older, carrying memories that never loosened their grip, shadows that crept into his sleep, teaching him to fear smiles and soft voices. Katherine lived with the knowledge that survival came at a price paid by others. And somewhere in the wilderness, the echo of that chapel lingered, a reminder that evil does not always arrive screaming. Sometimes it waits patiently, wrapped in virtue, preaching softly, until the gospel of the haunted is written once more in silence and blood. Katherine Patterson did not return to a quiet life after escaping the chapel. Survival did not bring relief. It ignited an obsession that burned through her days and haunted her nights. She spoke again and again, to soldiers, to territorial officials, to men who carried badges and promises of justice. She told her story until her voice went hoarse, until memory itself felt flayed raw. She became the living proof that the Graysons were not a rumor, not a fever dream born of grief, but a deliberate machinery of death. Without her, the truth would have remained buried beneath hymns and hollow prayers. With her, the nightmare had a name. Her recollections were precise, relentless. She described the rituals of kindness, The careful words, the medicines mixed in secret, the ledgers hidden like sacred texts beneath the chapel floor. Investigators listened, unsettled by the calm logic behind the crimes. Piece by piece, her testimony revealed not madness, but method. Yet even as authorities began to understand the scope of what they faced, the Graysons were already gone. They did not flee in panic. They vanished with preparation. Years of murder had taught them how to erase themselves. They carried stolen wealth that could buy silence, supplies, and new beginnings. They knew the land better than any mapmaker, every back trail and forgotten crossing etched into memory. Most dangerous of all, they understood people. They knew how easily trust could be shaped, how faith could be worn like a mask. When the manhunt finally began in earnest, it felt as though it was chasing shadows. The Graysons were not fugitives hiding in caves. They were ghosts moving openly through communities that did not yet know them. Federal Marshal William Harris soon realized he was not hunting criminals driven by desperation. He was tracking predators who had refined killing into routine. In his reports, he wrote with unease, noting that their greatest weapon was not poison or blade, but belief. People wanted to believe in charity, wanted to believe in sanctuaries along the trail, and that desire made them blind. Months stretched into years with no capture. Leads dissolved. Witnesses doubted themselves. Some refused to accept that the kindly religious family they had once met could be capable of such horror. It was as if the Graysons continued killing even in absence, poisoning certainty itself. Then came the whisper from the south. Reports from a remote mission near the border between Oregon and California, a place that had appeared suddenly, offering aid where travelers most needed it. Families arrived exhausted and hopeful. Families did not leave. Locals spoke quietly of disappearances, of wagons abandoned, of prayers unanswered. To most, it was rumor. To Marshal Harris, it was a familiar shape emerging from the dark. The mission called itself a place of mercy. Its leaders wore new names, new smiles. A father, a sister, a brother. Their voices carried the same cadence of reassurance. Harris recognized the pattern immediately. The location was perfect, intercepting isolated travelers moving between territories. The buildings were larger, more complex, with basements that swallowed light. It was not just a refuge. It was an evolution. This time, Harris refused to rush. He gathered soldiers and agents and placed them in the hills like silent sentinels. For weeks they watched. What they saw chilled them. The family running the mission was the Graysons reborn, refined by experience, unburdened by hesitation. They no longer waited passively for opportunity. They created it. One family in particular drew their attention. The Hendersons arrived with the weary confidence of people who believed their hard work would carry them safely to a new life. Their wagon was heavy with tools, supplies, and quiet wealth. From the first greeting, the pattern unfolded with terrifying familiarity. The false priest assessed. The false healer chose her targets. The false brother inventoried possessions with casual interest. But there were changes. New faces lingered near the mission, men posing as traders and scouts, watching the roads, signaling arrivals. The operation had grown. Bodies were handled more efficiently, evidence erased more completely. and the methods were shifting. Agents observed preparations that suggested speed rather than patience. The Graysons had learned from their brush with exposure. Slow death invited risk. Faster endings meant fewer questions. As days passed, the Henderson family slipped deeper into the web. The agents watched children laugh near the mission doors, unaware that they were being measured, timed, reduced to outcomes. Marshal Harris felt the weight of every hour. He knew what was happening. He had seen it before through Katherine's eyes. But intervention carried its own danger. Move too soon, and the Graysons might scatter again, leaving no proof, no justice. Wait too long, and an entire family would be erased. Night after night, he wrestled with the decision, listening to the wind scrape against stone, watching lantern light flicker like dying stars. The mission stood calm, a lie made solid, preaching safety to those who needed it most. Somewhere inside, poison waited. Somewhere beneath, records were already being written. Chris understood then that this was not simply a pursuit of criminals. It was a confrontation with a philosophy. The Graysons believed themselves chosen, rewarded for their deception, justified by survival and profit. They would not stop on their own. They would only grow bolder. As dawn crept over the hills, the marshal knew the moment was coming. One way or another, the cycle would break here, or it would continue, carrying the gospel of the haunted father down the trail, whispered in every vanished name and every unmarked grave, whispers from distant outposts, and scattered reports of sudden sickness at isolated missions began to converge into a single, dreadful shape. What once seemed like coincidence hardened into pattern, and that pattern bore the unmistakable imprint of the Graysons. Marshal Harris understood the weight of what lay before him. To act too quickly risked letting them slip away yet again, reborn under new names, carrying their poison into fresh soil. To hesitate meant allowing innocent lives to be extinguished, while proof accumulated in ledgers written with blood. The choice tore at him until fate itself removed the luxury of delay. One of his agents, watching from the trees before dawn, saw Brother Ezekiel move with unnatural care toward the Henderson camp. In his hands was a cup of milk, offered with a smile that did not reach his eyes. Minutes later, the youngest Henderson child collapsed, racked by sudden agony, a healthy body turning traitor from within. The poison worked too fast to be mistaken for illness. In that instant, uncertainty died. "We move," Chris ordered, his voice stripped of hesitation. "Man OW." Morning broke beneath the thunder of boots and shouted commands. The mission of divine mercy was surrounded before its bells could ring. Armed men closed every path, sealing exits, choking off escape. Inside, the Graysons woke to judgment. What investigators uncovered went far beyond rumor or fear. Beneath the mission, darkness revealed itself as a warehouse of stolen lives. Possessions lay stacked and sorted with obscene care, labeled and preserved like offerings. There were too many to count quickly, relics from families erased not only here, but far beyond these hills. Hidden rooms yielded records that stretched across territories, a map of death drawn in ink and patience. Names from Oregon, California, and places farther east stared back from the pages. The killings had not begun with the chapel. They had been perfected there. The journals traced their origin to earlier years, when the Graysons drifted from settlement to settlement, leaving silence where voices had once been. Investigators realized they were not uncovering a spree, but a heist or Father Morai's writings told a story more chilling than any confession. Early passages trembled with justification, cloaked in scripture and false mercy. He wrote of easing suffering, of God's reward for difficult service. But as the years passed, faith fell away like a discarded costume. Later entries spoke only of efficiency, yield, and refinement. Human beings became units. Families became opportunities. Death became process. The words were neat, unemotional, precise. Reading them felt like standing inside the mind of something no longer human. The most horrifying passages spoke not of the past, but of the future. Plans for expansion filled entire pages. Multiple missions, separate routes, a network of sanctuaries designed to harvest travelers at scale. Morai wrote of killing groups faster, cleaner, with methods that reduced time and risk. He saw patience as a flaw now, not a virtue. He wanted speed. He wanted volume. He wanted legacy. The raid came just in time for the Hendersons. Pulled back from the brink, they survived to speak. James Henderson's testimony shook hardened soldiers. He described how easily they had been guided, how trust had been cultivated like a crop. He spoke of the calm voices, the gentle hands, the authority that dissolved doubt. They felt like an answer to prayer, he said, his voice breaking. If someone had warned me they were monsters, I would have laughed. I would have prayed for the person who said it. Interrogations followed, and each Grayson revealed a different face of the same evil. Sister Constance showed no sorrow. Her anger flared not at the deaths she caused, but at being stopped. She spoke of mercy with a surgeon's detachment, insisting that those who died were spared worse fates. She believed herself righteous, her work interrupted by ignorance. To her, poison was medicine, and murder was kindness. Brother Ezekiel said nothing. He stared through questioners as though they were not there, a man hollowed out by obedience. His silence was its own confession. He had not needed belief. He had needed instruction. Father Morai, however, dropped the mask entirely. Gone was the preacher's warmth, the cadence of scripture. What remained was cold clarity. Presented with evidence, with survivors' words, with the undeniable weight of numbers, he did not flinch. Instead, he spoke with pride. He called it selection. He called it redistribution. He claimed purpose where there was only hunger. He spoke as if death itself had chosen him as its accountant. Listening to him, investigators felt the room grow colder. As records were compared and disappearances aligned, the scale of devastation became undeniable. Names long written off as lost to wilderness or chance were reclaimed as victims. Graves once dismissed as frontier tragedies now bore a different meaning. The trail itself seemed haunted by the realization of how much had been hidden in plain sight. The exposure of the Graysons shattered something fundamental in the frontier psyche. Charity became suspect. Faith was approached with caution. Travelers learned to look twice at open doors and gentle smiles. The idea that evil could kneel, pray, and offer medicine changed the way people survived. And yet, even as justice closed its grip, the echoes lingered. Survivors carried scars that never healed. Communities remembered the lesson with unease. Somewhere between belief and fear, a silence settled over the trail, because the gospel of the haunted was never just about the Graysons. It was about how easily darkness could borrow the language of light, how patiently it could wait, and how many lives it could claim before anyone dared to see it for what it truly was. By the time the investigation finally drew to a close, the true scope of the Grayson family's atrocities had become impossible to ignore. Authorities traced a trail of death that stretched across state lines, across territories, across the vast expanse of the frontier, revealing more than 800 victims whose lives had been stolen in silence. And yet, the number was almost certainly higher. Countless families had vanished along the lonely trails. Transient travelers whose disappearances were never recorded, never questioned, whose fates had been quietly sealed by the hands of those who hid behind crosses and gentle smiles. When the trial of the Graysons began in September of 1857, it quickly became a spectacle unlike anything the American frontier had ever witnessed. The courtroom swelled with anticipation, reporters scribbling furiously to capture every whispered horror, every revelation of cruelty. The prosecution, led by territorial attorney General Samuel Morrison, faced an almost impossible task. How could they present the scale of murder, the intricacies of calculated poisonings, when so many victims were gone, when the perpetrators had erased their traces with practiced precision? The key lay in Father Murray's own hand. In the journals he had meticulously maintained, each page a chilling testament to premeditation and cold efficiency. Those pages were confessions disguised as ledgers. They detailed the methods used to kill, the possessions stolen, the profits calculated, all in Murray's meticulous script. No explanation could dispute the truth written there. Each entry revealed a mind that measured human life as one would inventory cattle or coin. The journal spoke not just of death, but of study and refinement, of a family who had perfected murder over decades. It was Katherine Patterson's testimony, however, that brought those cold words into terrifying, living reality. She recounted with clarity how the Graysons had ensnared her family, how their patience and manipulation had allowed the slow poisoning of the innocent to unfold almost like a sermon, every word and act calibrated to gain trust before delivering death. The Henderson family, too, provided damning testimony. Their survival had been miraculous, a narrow escape from the poison-laden hands of the Graysons at the mission of divine mercy. Through them, the court learned that the Graysons had adapted, evolved. They had experimented with swifter methods of murder, designed to eliminate entire families within days rather than weeks, reducing the risk of suspicion while increasing their efficiency. They had recruited others to assist, disguised as traders or helpers, extending their reach and control. Every detail of their operation had been refined by experience, a horror engineered with surgical precision. Physical evidence bolstered the testimony. Investigators presented the very tools of murder, vials of poisoned medicine, white powders masquerading as blessed salts, maps marking unmarked graves, and correspondence with dealers who trafficked in stolen goods. The pattern was undeniable. Death followed the Graysons like a shadow, methodical and intentional. attempts by defense attorneys to frame the deaths as the unavoidable toll of disease along the frontier faltered under scrutiny. Patterns repeated too precisely, symptoms aligned too neatly with arsenic poisoning, and the journals themselves left no room for misinterpretation. As the trial wore on, week after week, the enormity of the Graysons' crimes became clear to the nation. Newspapers chronicled the systematic slaughter of families seeking refuge, families drawn to trust, lured by the guise of Christian charity. The proceedings laid bare the terrifying ease with which predators could manipulate faith, exploiting kindness and desperation for evil purposes. And the courtroom listened as Father Morai's own hand painted the ledger of their murderous enterprise, turning human lives into profit, moral conscience into calculation. The verdicts were swift and historic. Father Morai was sentenced to death by hanging, the ultimate price for orchestrating unimaginable cruelty. Sister Constance received life imprisonment, a rare frontier sentence for a woman, her legacy forever stained by the calculated destruction of those who had sought her care. Brother Ezekiel, silent and obedient, was sentenced to 20 years in territorial prison, a witness to horror who had served the family's dark enterprise without question. With the Graysons finally removed from the trail, the shadow that had haunted travelers for over a decade was lifted, though the echoes of their crimes lingered. The impact of their actions extended far beyond the immediate victims. Travelers approached offers of help with new wariness, their trust forever tempered by the knowledge that evil could sit beneath a veil of virtue. Religious communities were forced to confront the terrifying reality that faith and charity could be manipulated, that kindness could conceal malevolence. Even legitimate missionaries found their work shadowed by suspicion. As every act of aid carried the weight of caution, the Graysons had also exposed the vulnerabilities of frontier law enforcement. Their decade-long spree had relied on slow communication between territories, on isolation and the inability of authorities to share information about missing persons. In response, interterritorial communication improved. Procedures for investigating disappearances became more systematic, and law enforcement slowly adapted to a world where evil could move silently, patiently, and unseen. Katherine Patterson, the survivor whose courage had brought the Graysons to justice, never fully healed from the trauma she endured. Her days were spent advocating for travelers' safety, advising authorities, and working to ensure that no other family would fall prey to those who wielded faith as a weapon. Her life became a testament to survival in the shadow of unspeakable evil, a reminder of how fragile trust can be, how closely horror can hide behind the trappings of light. And so the story of the Graysons, of the families they destroyed, and of the survivor who refused to yield, remained etched in the collective memory of the frontier. It was a story that spoke of patience, calculation, and the audacity of malevolence masquerading as virtue. It was a story that reminded all who heard it that evil does not always announce itself with fire or scream. It can wait quietly, wrapped in kindness, smiling as it reaches for the unsuspecting, until the gospel of the haunted is written once more, line by line, life by life, in shadows and silence, leaving only the memory of what had been lost. Timothy Patterson, the young boy who had narrowly survived the Graysons' calculated attempt on his life, grew into adulthood haunted not only by the memories of what had been taken from him, but by the invisible scars that trauma leaves behind. He never married, never knew the comfort of children of his own. Instead, he roamed the wilderness as a frontier guide, leading families along trails that had once been death traps, quietly warning them of dangers he could not erase, teaching vigilance against strangers who offered aid with hands that might conceal poison. Every creek and ridge, every shadowed hollow, carried whispers of the past, a haunting echo of the Sacred Heart Chapel and the Mission of Divine Mercy, sites once sacred only in name, now forever stained by the Graysons' meticulous cruelty. The places themselves no longer existed. Communities, unwilling to tolerate the physical reminders of horror, razed the buildings, scattering the ashes of sacred facades along the wind. The chapel burned to the ground in 1858, and the mission was dismantled, its timber repurposed for new constructions, as if to erase memory itself. Yet, no amount of fire or rebuilding could touch the deeper, invisible wreckage. Across the Western Territories, families told the stories in hushed tones, cautionary tales whispered around campfires about the false missionaries, about the smiling, kind men and women who could wield faith as a weapon, who could sit beside the dying while their hands administered the slow, certain hand of death. The Graysons had been frighteningly ordinary. Morai, Constance, and Ezekiel were not monstrous by appearance. They were intelligent, articulate, charming, convincing. They understood human trust, human hope, and they exploited it without hesitation. Over a decade, they had perfected a terrifying blend of virtue and villainy, convincing others that they were agents of mercy while orchestrating methodical slaughter. Their story shattered illusions of safety and challenged the assumption that goodness could always be recognized, revealing instead that evil could be patient, deliberate, and disguised in the most comforting forms. Perhaps the most horrifying truth was that the Graysons believed themselves righteous. They had convinced themselves that their acts were a form of service, that eliminating the weak and diseased travelers was a moral duty, a divine act of redistribution that justified murder. This self-righteousness, unaccompanied by guilt, painted them as beings whose corruption was deeper than mere greed. It was a perversion of morality itself, a chilling lesson in how intelligence and devotion can be twisted into instruments of destruction. The legacy of their crimes is woven into the very fabric of the frontier, a reminder that westward expansion was not only a story of courage and perseverance, but also one shadowed by predators who understood human vulnerability intimately. More than 800 lives were extinguished, families erased, trust shattered. The narrative of the Graysons illustrates both the darkest and most resilient sides of humanity, the horror that cruelty can manifest behind the most benign of masks, and the courage of those who resist, who survive, who testify. Katherine Patterson's survival became a bulwark against oblivion. Her testimony not only exposed the Graysons, but created a shield for countless future travelers. She gave voice to the dead, turning private terror into public reckoning, and in doing so, prevented further murders. Her bravery, and the lives she helped protect, serve as enduring proof that even in the shadow of overwhelming darkness, resistance is possible and vigilance matters. The frontier itself became a teacher through the legacy of the Graysons. Travelers learned to be wary, not from mere fear, but from understanding that evil often masquerades as good, that kindness may conceal calculation, and that survival sometimes demands observation, skepticism, and courage. Religious communities learned hard lessons about trust, about the way authority can be manipulated, and about the danger posed when morality is distorted by cunning minds. These lessons reverberated beyond individual experiences, reshaping the practices of law enforcement and the collective memory of settlers, embedding caution into the cultural fabric of the West. Even more haunting is the awareness that the Graysons were not anomalies in some distant moral universe. Their crimes demonstrate how methodical, intelligent people can commit unimaginable atrocities, how easily human instincts for trust and faith can be exploited, and how deeply evil can disguise itself in symbols of virtue. The story forces us to confront a sobering truth, that darkness does not always roar, that it can wait, patient and precise, hiding behind the garb of piety, while accumulating the power to strike when trust is highest. Over a century and a half later, the tale of the Graysons continues to linger like a shadow along the old trails of the American West. The burned chapel, the dismantled mission, and the empty graves are only physical markers of horror. The real imprint lies in memory, the whispered stories, the warnings, the survival of those who refused to be silenced. It is in the caution with which families approach strangers, in the awareness that even faith could be weaponized, that their story endures. And yet, intertwined with this darkness is the persistence of courage, the defiance of those like Katherine and Timothy Patterson. They remind us that even amidst calculated evil, human resilience can survive. They ensure that truth and justice can follow closely on the heels of horror. The Graysons' crimes, horrifying as they were, illuminate the necessity of vigilance, the value of skepticism, and the strength of those who act to protect the innocent. In the end, the Graysons' story is a chilling mirror. It shows us the terrifying potential of deception, the way evil can manipulate the noblest instincts for gain, and the fragility of trust when it meets calculation and cruelty. It reminds us that vigilance and courage are not optional, they are survival, and it ensures that the gospel of the haunted, written in silence, in suffering, and in the testimony of the living, continues to echo across the hills, rivers, and trails of the American frontier, a warning to anyone who dares to believe that kindness alone is a shield against the darkness. Even now, when the wind whispers across abandoned trails, when the echo of lost voices drifts through the trees, the Graysons' legacy is there, silent, patient, and haunting. It is a reminder that evil can lie dormant, that it can wait until trust is complete, and that vigilance, courage, and truth are the only barriers between life and the quiet horror that waits in shadows.